Kherson has surrendered, and now Russia's elite have turned their fight inwards as a hunt for traitors flares up behind Kremlin walls. I'm Ekaterina Kutrikadze, and this is Russia Tomorrow. Soldiers from around the country are raising their voices to complain that everything in the military supply chain is broken and nothing is being done to prepare the mobilized for combat. As Russia's military begins a full retreat from Kherson this week, the Kremlin's information war is turning inwards, and state media are being ordered to remove the last non-aligned voices from its airwaves. Russia's Orthodox Church is at war in Ukraine. Why does the religious institution support the invasion, and who within the church is speaking out against?
TV Rain, Дождь, the only Russia's independent network.
We are not allowed to work in our country anymore.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk to you.
It's a real war.
Maybe there are some negotiations about that.
There will be very serious consequences.
TV Rain Newsroom presents Russia Tomorrow.
By calling for a nationwide mobilization of reserve soldiers in September, Vladimir Putin and his administration took on a giant risk. The Kremlin brought the war directly into the homes and hearts of millions of Russians, and in the immediate wake of the call-up, hundreds of thousands of Russian men fled the country. Tens of thousands found themselves in the army after choosing to stay. Now these mobilized soldiers are being sent to the front lines by military leadership that drops them off in the forest and leaves them on their own, often with insufficient training, poor equipment and no ammunition. Earlier this month, more than 100 soldiers from Chuvashia region who were mobilized organized a soldiers' labor strike in the city of Ulyanovsk to demand proper equipment and the pay bonus that Vladimir Putin promised in October.
Я с Москвы приехал в свой родной город, чтобы уйти со своими ребятами, потому что Родина, и потому что президент обращение сделал ко всем. Один раз в военкомат я пришел, он сказал, мне объяснил военком, военный комиссар, что говорит, вы только туда, как приедете в течение 2-3 дней, единоразовая выплата будет в размере 300 тысяч. И пошли вперед
одно, я вам не обещала 300 тысяч.
Понятное дело, что вы нам сейчас здесь рассказываете, то, что у нас просто и все.
And now, average Russians from around the country are raising their voices to complain that everything in the military supply chain is broken and nothing is being done to prepare the mobilized for combat.
Вот такие каски пришли со Ставропольского края. Это просто вот руками ее сжали, вот она разрывается. Посмотрите, там про пулю даже слова нет, вот.
Новый, дешевый, смотри. Переключение режима огня. Шарманка.
Автоматом. Пулеметом.
Смотри, качество. Качество.
Давай твой.
Смотри, кал внутри. Чисто.
Стоим на передке, блядь. Все наше обеспечение. Патронов нет. Гранат толком нет, жрачки нет, воды нет.
From the Orlovsky district between the Black Sea and the Caspian, soldiers posted social media videos that show equipment provided by their local governor, Andrei Klitschkov. Waterproof rubber gardening boots instead of protective winter military footwear. Cheap and dull knife blades that bend sideways but don't cut. Rucksacks that rip apart like paper dolls. Klitschkov quickly took to social media to respond, and in his tie and short sleeves explained that the governor's office bought everything they could and then gave mobilized soldiers these items because there was nothing else in stock. Klitschkov also said if the reservists didn't like it, they could buy their own.
I cannot imagine that I would destroy the clothes given to me after having a drink, then tell everyone how bad their quality was. I don't know if it was their own stuff or stuff that was given to them. That's on their conscience. Nevertheless, we have reserves for this kind of situation, and when I go visit the boys in Smolensk, we'll replace anything that's torn up. You say we bought the cheapest possible uniforms for the guys, but we bought the best available with our resources. There was nothing else. All this talk about uniforms. Now people are getting paid. If you want, you can get a new uniform yourself. People are breaking their knives. Why would you do that? Explain it to me, please. I can destroy whatever I want to. I could take my tie and tear it up right now, or my shirt and say it was a bad quality shirt. But you take what you can get.
In other parts of Russia, the situation is much the same. From Novosibirsk, an experienced artillery soldier went back into the army voluntarily and even bought his own clothing and equipment, but found himself assigned to demining operations in a non-artillery unit. Alexei Kurmashov said he supported Russia's special military operation in Ukraine, but now finds himself using equipment 30 years older than he is and completely incapable of detecting modern landmines. With his fellow soldiers, he is now crowdfunding on social media for better tools. Perhaps most troubling for the Kremlin are the mothers of mobilized sons from the Voronezh region who took brave steps and publicly called for their boys to be brought back, saying they're alone at the conflict line with no senior officers, with nothing but an automatic rifle for defense.
Наши сыновья просят помощи. Их предательски бросают на периферии одних. С ними нет командования. Мой сын выходил из окружения в районе Краснопоповки 23 числа. Прошел пешком с группой 16 человек. Также из нашего Павловского района, пройдя путь больше 140 километров. И сразу же им поставили условия. Они обязаны вернуться на передовую. В руках только автоматы. Автоматы против БТРов и против танков.
Наш сын вышел на связь, просит о помощи. Они буквально выползли из-под трупов.
And in Ukraine itself, recently mobilized Russian soldiers from the Moscow region were captured together outside Svatovo after less than a month back in service, and described in a video released by Ukraine's military how their leadership left them with no food in wet foxholes and then shelled their own troops for 3 days in crossfire.
Командование бросает.
Мы военнослужащие 9-го полка, нас просто бросили на убой. По 3 суток не ели, не пили, жили в окопах и мокро.
Никакой информации, телефоны, все связь с семьей вообще отсутствует. Ничего нельзя сказать. Свои же обстреляли.
Ничего.
Свои же по своим стреляют, обстреливают. Сидели 3 суток, по нам шмаляли, свои.
Это говорим как есть.
Без брони, а именно глазами, которые мы увидели здесь, а не которые нам в уши ссут там и граждан.
Которые даже месяца нету, что уже мобилизовали. Уже куда-то отправили, непонятно куда.
На передовую.
Да, на передовую, пацаны, не 1500, как вам говорят, то, что приедете и будете в Белгороде. Все
вместо уйти. А люди здесь относятся совсем по-другому. Все кормят, моют, одевают, без всяких инцидентов. Относятся в 2 раза лучше, чем наша команда.
Командование в первую очередь покидает корабль.
Да.
Убежали самые первые. Начался обстрел, они убежали самые первые.
Ни связи, ничего. Бросили, не сказали.
Away from the front lines in Ukraine, Russia's regional governors and local administrators can shift blame to avoid direct conflict with mobilized soldiers or mothers. But in the occupied territory of the Donetsk region, military officials have recently begun to imprison soldiers who refuse to fight and threaten them with a firing line execution. The sister of one soldier being held for refusing to fight said her brother's group was sent to the front just 9 days after being called up, instead of receiving a 2-month combat course as promised.
My brother's wife wrote to both the Ministry of Defense and the Department for the Protection of Human Rights. She wrote several letters with no results. They all forward the messages to each other. They say it was transferred to the next department, but they never say anything specific or do anything. Nothing at all.
Military analyst Igor Raev says recent combat losses for Russia have become so problematic in Ukraine that military commanders have simply fallen back on an old practice of plugging holes in the front lines with cannon fodder.
And it is due to the poor quality of training of the soldiers that were sent to the front. This is quite obvious. and it seems that they're being assigned tasks that they're not ready to perform. The Russian military leadership has made the decision to do this because the situation in certain areas of the front was very critical, so they decided to plug the holes in the front line with cannon fodder. There's nothing to be surprised about here. It's a pretty common practice, and I think it's neither the first nor last time that Russian military leadership has made such a decision.
What is wrong with the Russian army? Is this a new trend, or it would be necessary to know the history of the Kremlin's wars to answer this question? We are now joined by longtime BBC Moscow correspondent and international affairs editor at France 24, Robert Parsons. Hi, Robert. Good to see you on TV Rain. I think this is the first experience we are talking, and you know, it means a lot to me because we know each other for a very, very long time, and I know that you have a huge experience considering Russian military, and you know, you have been there at the war in Chechnya. You have seen with your own eyes how this system works. And could you please, in a couple of words, describe what is Russian military?
Oh, that's a huge question. I mean, but you're right. I have seen a lot of experience of the Russian military in Chechnya on many, many occasions during both wars. In Georgia in 2008, in Crimea in 2014, in Donbass from 2014 onwards, and this year 3 times. I spent almost 2 months in Ukraine, seeing how the Russian military operates. You know, this time round, I must admit, I was not expecting things to fall apart quite in the way they were, because after Vladimir Putin announced a massive reform of the Russian military, which he said was intended to modernize it, to make it, you know, like a genuine modern army, high-tech, very well equipped, well trained. And, you know, everybody bought into that because the Russians spent a massive amount of money. You know, as a proportion of GDP, it was higher than the United States. Not in absolute terms, of course, because the US budget is so much bigger than the Russian one. But for Russia, it was a massive injection of cash. And we all thought, you know, when this war started on February the 24th, and I was in Kiev the day it started. That this
really? I didn't know that. I didn't know that.
Yeah, I was there, but I woke up in the morning and it had started. You know, we all thought that the Russians were going to demonstrate these new skills, these new capacities, but it didn't happen at all. It was, again and again, we were just seeing the same old thing. A very highly centralized army, in which there was very little communication between the branches of the military, so that the artillery was not at all operating in conjunction with the infantry on the ground or with the air force in the skies. So with that lack of coordination, we suddenly started to realize that things weren't going to go for the Russians quite as well as they thought they were going to go. And I remember when I was there talking to people from the International Legion, a couple of British soldiers and an American soldier I met who had been, you know, on the front line fighting the Russians with their Ukrainian comrades when the Russians came into the north of Kiev. And they were saying that the Russian artillery was incredibly powerful. You know, they'd never experienced anything like it. But the infantry was very poor, and the coordination between the branches of the military was non-existent. And that was why the Russians failed in their attack on Kiev, because the coordination was so bad. The Ukrainian army was much more agile, much more effective, despite the fact that they had less weaponry, less men. They were just much more efficient about using their resources. And we saw the result. So that, you know, one thought that maybe after that experience in the area north of Kiev, that the Russian military might go away and think, well, we've got to do this, we've got to do that to improve things. But they have demonstrated that they're not able to do that. And part of the reason for that, I suspect, is that the chain of command, like Russian society, is so authoritarian, so centralized, that they find it very difficult to respond in an elastic sort of way to challenges like this. You know, the people from the top down to the bottom aren't used to thinking for themselves. They take a command and act on it. And it seems to me, I'm not claiming to be a military expert, but that to me seems to be the heart of the problem for the Russians. Since then, there are more issues as well.
Yeah, but can you say that, can we make a conclusion that these problems with the chain of command and maybe corruption, because I've heard a lot of stories, and you tell me whether this is true or maybe I'm exaggerating the problem, that this is something that was in Russian army before this war, that it was something with Russian army in times of Chechnya and then in times of Georgia, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, is there a trend that we can see right now, the same as it was in 90s?
Yes. I mean, in a nutshell, yeah, that's a part of the problem. You can obviously, Russia has a very corrupt society from the top to the bottom. Every branch of government is riddled with corruption. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is you could say exactly the same thing about Ukraine. Ukraine was perhaps not on the same scale, but Ukraine is also very corrupt. Except that the Ukrainians seem to have done something quite remarkable with their armed forces in the years since 2014, perhaps because they've been aided by the training they've had with NATO countries in those intervening years. But somehow they've managed to keep the military, by and large, although there have been problems with supply and procurement, and that sort of thing, where corruption has come in. But by and large, the Ukrainian military seems to have been an exception to other branches of Ukrainian government. Not the case in Russia at all, where for many people who become senior officers, generals, that is an opportunity to make money rather than to serve the motherland. Yeah, this is a pity, I would say. Robert, one more thing. We can see what's going on right now with the mobilized men in different parts of Russia who are still there, and also what happens to those who are on the front line, who do not understand what's going on, who don't have ammunition, who don't have, clothing, and so on and so forth. And this is something, again, that makes me think about the attitude of Russian commanders to the soldiers, to the people that they're sending to the war. What have you seen in Chechnya, for example? I'm just referring to your experience because it's really interesting to understand whether we can, compare what's going on right now with that times. Well, the interesting thing is that in Chechnya, it was largely a conscript army. And just as in this war in Ukraine, most of the conscripts came from ethnic minorities like Bashkortostan and so on. I saw more Bashkirs on the front lines in Chechnya than I've seen anywhere else in Russia. The poor guys were just there as cannon fodder, as the Russians put it themselves. That was a major phenomenon particularly in the first Chechen war, when the Russians were very badly organized, very badly trained. They did learn as they went along and got better, and some of the troops were much better. But in the first Chechen war, the quality was very bad indeed. The soldiers were very inexperienced, very young, very badly equipped, just like today. But the interesting thing today is that in the first few months, when the soldiers were not people who had been mobilized, but professionals, they didn't seem to do very much better. So you have to ask yourself the question, what on earth is going on? What happened to that reform in the Russian army? They were meant to become model professionals. And, it is clear, and we have to say this, I think, that there are elements within the Russian armed forces which are highly professional and very good at their jobs. But the problem is that the majority, it seems, are not. And the commanders are not. But to move on back to your question again, clearly there is an analogy to be drawn, because you're having failed in the first part of the war with the profession. Vladimir Putin has decided that He's got to do something to avoid further humiliation, after that catastrophe with the counteroffensive by the Ukrainians in Kharkiv. That something had to be done. And, I think because he was completely at a loss as to know what to do, he went for rapid mobilization. Mobilization, which was characterized by massive inefficiency and chaos, which compounded the existing problems you always get with a mobilization. The problem is now, of course, the troops who are being sent to the front have no training, very little at least. Their equipment is extremely poor. Sometimes they've not got food. Sometimes they've not got water either. Very little ammunition. Their commanders are incompetent and cowardly. And they, are, in many cases, have simply abandoned them on the front lines to be shelled by Ukrainian artillery. And no wonder we hear that hundreds of mobilized soldiers are being killed. Hundreds are surrendering to the Ukrainian armed forces. Because these people are absolutely useless as they're not professional soldiers, and they're up against an army which is showing itself to be very competent and increasingly well armed, thanks to the weaponry that the Ukrainian armed forces has been getting from NATO.
The last thing, Robert, I would like to ask you about is the, again, analogy, if the analogy is possible, about the reaction of the Russian society on what is going on. I was very young when Russia was fighting the first Chechen war and then second Chechen war, but I remember that the protest in Russia was huge. I remember that, well, the media coverage was active and there were independent media outlets in Russia, but still, why is it so today that, yes, we can see some kind of, sparkles of protest in the country, but this is not a massive thing. How would you explain that?
Well, not yet, anyway. I think it could become a massive thing if this goes on for much longer, because essentially, I think this is, well, there are two factors at play here. I think one of them is information, and the other one is fear. And Russia today is a very different place than Russia in the 1990s. In the 1990s, as you correctly point out, there were independent television stations, NTV, for instance, who's had reporters actively in the field in Chechnya, reporting direct, on air from the field, with no attempt to filter the information. That today is absolutely inconceivable, as you know very well, in the Russian media environment. That's one reason why there's just no information, or very little. You have to work hard to get the information in Russia today. The other one, as I was just saying, is fear. This is a society which has been cowed by Vladimir Putin and his government. People are terrified of being sent off to prison, because they know that if they say, even if they say, for instance, something as blatantly obvious that this is a war that's happening in Ukraine, that is an offense that could get you sent to prison, because it's a special military operation as far as Vladimir Putin and his ministers are concerned. So when you have that heavy load on your back, most ordinary people are not prepared to take that risk. You have to be a very brave person in those circumstances to make your voice heard and be prepared to take the risk of being arrested, beaten up, and sent to prison. But that's the sort of society that Russia is today. It keeps people quiet, but the problem for the regime is it's also a very inefficient society, as we've seen with the performance of the Russian army in Ukraine.
Robert, thank you very much, and thanks for your description of Russian society. I think it's exactly what you are saying. So years spent in Moscow gives you a big prospect, a bigger prospect than others can have. So, Robert Parsons, thanks for participating.
Thank you.
And yet, all of this recent military protest activity is happening at the same time that hundreds, if not thousands, of Russians are behind bars on charges of having discredited the reputation of the Russian army by protesting the war in Ukraine. Some were brave enough to stand up in public and protest. Others were raided at home by teams of masked men with automatic rifles who came to confiscate computers and digital files. One such protester is Ilya Yashin, a Russian opposition politician who was detained in mid-July on charges of damaging the reputation of Russia's military. Recently, Yashin's pre-trial detention in Moscow was extended until the end of November, and he responded with a simple summary of the events around the so-called special military operation in Ukraine.
To the Honorable Judge, Prosecutor and Investigator, back in the summer, any criticism of the army leadership was considered criminal. Even the mere questioning of the general's infallibility could put you behind bars. Every statement by Shoigu and Kononchikov was presented as the ultimate truth, and those who disagreed were treated as criminals. You put me in jail for questioning the truthfulness of the Defense Ministry's statements about the war in Ukraine, but for some reason you have no issues with Prigozhin and Kadyrov, who have enough power to get the generals to do and say anything. By imprisoning innocent people, you're not just playing along with corrupt politicians and law enforcement officers. You give them, and especially President Putin, a sense of impunity and complete invincibility. It is this sensibility that has led our country to a bloody war and tens of thousands of deaths. And you, honorable gentlemen, have to live with that.
Thank you for watching Russia Tomorrow, and please consider supporting our news broadcast on GoFundMe. With your donation, we're able to continue our work bringing the truth to millions of Russians. See the description below for a link to our GoFundMe page.
Russia Tomorrow.
As Russia's military begins a full retreat from the previously occupied city of Kherson this week, the Kremlin's information war is turning inwards. Now a rearguard conflict in Moscow among Russia's political and military clans is quickly coming into view, as Putin and the elite have begun a loyalty purge to erase any criticism of the war in Ukraine. The Kremlin's message is clear. After all independent journalists, all independent politicians and all alternative voices are destroyed, the time has come to search for traitors in the circles of relatively loyal figures. An unstoppable campaign of repression is coming into effect, where even deputies and government bureaucrats who spoke outside the shifting lines of Kremlin policy are being muted, their presence on state media cancelled. As independent Russian journalist in exile Yevgenia Albat said, what we are beginning to see are signs of smoke and the first sparks of a fire that is already raging behind the scenes.
Идет война всех со всеми.
It is a war of all against all. We've seen in the past few weeks how Shoigu and his generals have been attacked, with Kadyrov and Prigozhin as the predators. Now we get news about Sobchak, Karaulov and others with traces of evidence from the internal struggles in the KGB corporation that now controls power.
In recent weeks, prison tycoon Yevgeny Prigozhin and Chechen leader Ramzan Kadyrov have teamed up publicly on social media to criticize the generals in charge of the war. Together, these men have been seen to marginalize Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu, remove Central Military District Commander Alexander Lapin, and turn against St. Petersburg Governor Alexander Beglov.
Началась свалка. В самом верхнем эшелоне.
The purges have begun at the very top echelons of Russian power. We are witnesses to a feast by predators. It is a very important indicator that right now we are witnessing the demise of the Russian power corporation, and that Putin is no longer able to act as the middleman and mediator between the various interest groups. A war of all against all has begun. A completely Hobbesian reality. But it is enough for me to want to hope that this will all lead to the implosion of this completely inhuman regime responsible for deaths in Ukraine and these events with mobilized soldiers in Russia.
Last month, police and federal agents raided the offices of the Ostorozhno media company in Moscow and arrested its business manager Kirill Sukhanov and a former tabloid magazine editor on charges of attempting to extort Rostech CEO Sergei Chemezov for 11 million rubles, or slightly less than $200,000. If the Russian military uses a piece of technical equipment, there is a big chance that it has been produced by one of the many companies owned and controlled by Rostech. In fact, Chemezov, a core Putin's ally and a powerful member of the Siloviki, oversees more than 1,000 businesses employing more than 500,000 people who engineer, manufacture and produce equipment and weapons for Russia's military and export sales. Russia's most widely known military brand Kalashnikov is one of Rostech's companies, along with truck maker KAMAZ, tank and rail car builder Uralvagonzavod, airplane manufacturers Sukhoi and MiG, and the weapon sales company Rosoboron Export. During the Cold War, Chemezov and Vladimir Putin worked together at the KGB in Dresden and lived in the same East German apartment building. Years later, after he became president, Putin named Chemezov to run Rostech, the parent company of Russia's defense and aerospace industry. But Осторожно Media is owned by Ksenia Sobchak, a Russian media personality, a one-time presidential candidate, a self-styled independent journalist, and the widely rumored goddaughter of none other than Vladimir Putin. Sobchak got to where she is partly because her father, Anatoly Sobchak, was once Putin's boss in St. Petersburg. The liberal politician was first elected as mayor, then as governor, and then became a university law professor who served as a mentor and teacher for future presidents Vladimir Putin and Dmitry Medvedev. Sobchak, until recently, was seen as an untouchable person, but now even she is under threat. There are no more guarantees for anyone. In a time of war, there can be no liberties. And the fact that Sobchak knows Putin personally and closely no longer provides her immunity. Authorities say the journalists at Осторожно Media offered to block negative coverage of Chemezov for a fee. Last week, a third journalist, Andrei Karaulov, was also charged with slander by Chemezov for material on his Telegram channel that Rostech called rumors and speculation divorced from reality. Every day, more evidence comes out showing how unprepared Russia's security, intelligence and military circles, the Siloviki, were for Ukraine's forceful resistance to an invasion. Cleaning up the last Telegram channels that provide relatively critical coverage is part of the Kremlin's loyalty purge, which is why many analysts say Sobchak fled to Lithuania. She is the last person in any position of power and influence to have known Putin when he still had a boss.
Russia tomorrow.
Recently, a military priest from the Russian Orthodox Church was killed in Ukraine, where he served as a chaplain on a military garrison. For more on the Orthodox Church's long history of collaboration with Russian leaders, we now hear from my TVRAN colleague, Tikhon Dyadko.
Everything in Russia has recently been turned upside down, and the aggressive invasion of Ukraine is being labeled as Russia's defense against NATO. So, and it would be strange if it were otherwise, the Church has become one of the main ideological forces behind the war.
Ну и поскольку вы возглавляете, Владимир Васильевич, Росгвардию, то я хотел бы, чтобы этот образ именно был в рядах Росгвардии Российской Федерации.
Ваше Святейшество, благодарю вас за этот дар. Хочу пожелать вам многие лета во славу трудов ваших. И хочу довести до вас и до всех присутствующих здесь прихожан о том, что войска Национальной гвардии совместно с вооруженными силами Российской Федерации выполняют все поставленные задачи в ходе этой военной контроперации.
This video is from March 14th, 3 weeks after the invasion of Ukraine. The head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, presents an icon to the head of the National Guard, Viktor Zolotov. Zolotov's troops are in the town of Bucha, near Kiev at the time, where later hundreds of civilians were found murdered. Patriarch Kirill does not question the war. He doesn't call for peace. He uses the same words as Vladimir Putin when he justifies aggression against Ukraine.
Сегодня тема, связанная с российско-украинскими отношениями, стала частью большой, или, как говорят теперь, геополитики. И одной из целей этой геополитики является ослабление России, которая стала сильной, реально могучей страной.
The Russian Church has always been close to and cozied up to the state, and the state in Russia has always wanted the Church to be under its control. In the time of the Russian Empire, the Church was actually part of the state itself. In the Soviet Union, religion was forbidden and security services controlled the churches that continued to operate. Finally, in the 90s, the new Russian constitution stipulated that the church was separate entirely from the state, but the reality was completely different. According to official surveys, about 60% of Russians consider themselves Orthodox Christians. Even if one assumes that this figure is exaggerated, it still amounts to tens of millions of people that the Kremlin can influence through religion. In return, the church receives considerable financial support from the state.
Нельзя изучать историю России, не зная истории церкви. Ведь кто были такие патриархи? Рядом с царем всегда сидели царь и патриарх. История России, государства, история церкви настолько были тесно переплетены, что разорвать невозможно. А сейчас в учебном процессе разорвано.
Vladimir Putin carries himself like a Russian Tsar, and the church, led by Patriarch Kirill, is like a part of his kingdom. The Russian Orthodox Church supports all of the government's repressive and most scandalous initiatives, such as the ban on adoptions of Russian Orphans by Americans and anti-LGBT laws. Kirill Gavarun, a prominent theologian, believes that the church and state in Russia became especially close after Pussy Riot's famous protest in Moscow's Cathedral of Christ the Savior. At the time, the state sided with the church and sentenced the protesters who had burst into and gave an impromptu performance loaded with political statements to 2 years in prison.
For example, the Russian Church joined in the persecution of the famous group Pussy Riot. When the Russian Church did not support the protests in Bolotnaya Square and definitively took the side of the government, it was probably then that this fusion process began to take place, following the worst traditions of the Byzantine Empire.
I remember well when Metropolitan Ilarion, one of the leaders of the church, came on the air at TV Rain after the Pussy Riot protest and said that the church would not ask for mercy for the participants. I was not surprised at the time, but I could not imagine that 10 years later the Russian church would support the war. But even 2 years ago, it did not seem like such an impossible event. 2 years ago, the Patriarch inaugurated the Church of the Armed Forces, which, among other things, had a mural depicting Vladimir Putin as if the Russian president were no longer only a Tsar, but also a saint. And now several priests are officially blessing the Russian army before seeing them off to war. Some priests even teach people how to fire an RPG.
Московская духовная академия семинары сражается с НАТО. Христос воскресе!
And some are fighting in Ukraine themselves and dying there. One of them is priest Mikhail Vasilyev, rector of a church in one of the military garrisons. In his last interview, he urged women to give birth to more children so that it is less difficult to send their current children away to war.
Ну, я понимаю прекрасно, что каждой даме от природы Господь в большинстве случаев попустил родить множество деток. Если дама, исполняя эту заповедь Божию, плодитесь и размножайтесь, отказалась от, соответственно, искусственных средств прерывания беременности в самом широком спектре, то, очевидно, ребеночек у нее будет не один, а больше, в большинстве случаев. А значит, ей не так больно и страшно будет, соответственно, с ним расставаться, пусть даже на время.
Mikhail Vasilyev was killed during a battle not far from the city of Kherson. On Wednesday, Patriarch Kirill personally conducted his funeral ceremony. That circle has clues. Although the main virtue of Orthodoxy is peacefulness, this does not stop the leadership of the Russian Orthodox Church from supporting the invasion of Ukraine. Otherwise, it would lose the support of the state. In choosing between the Kremlin and the principles of Orthodoxy, the church leadership has chosen the Kremlin. However, one should not assume that there aren't those in the Russian Orthodox Church who do not support the war. In fact, there are, and there are many of them.
Я считаю войну против Украины преступлением и великим позором. Позором, который сделал нашу страну изгоем на мировой арене, с которой не хотят считаться и не доверяют уже словам наших правителей.
But expressing an anti-war stance in the church in Russia today is just as unsafe as it is in secular life. Despite this, nearly 300 priests wrote an open letter speaking against the war. The leadership condemned this appeal and claimed that the priests were unnecessarily engaging in politics, as if it was them sitting next to Putin, not Patriarch Kirill. But of course, they weren't being unduly political. They were doing what priests should be doing during a war of aggression, calling on the authorities to come to their senses and stop the bloodshed.
Russia Tomorrow.
This has been Russia Tomorrow. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, share with your friends, and support us on GoFundMe. The link is in the description. I am Ekaterina Katrikadze. See you soon.